Hello and welcome to a sort of, Afterthoughts video on H.G. Wells's The Invisible Man, a grotesque romance. Whenever I finished reading a book on this channel, I sit down and talk a bit about the book itself, right? Maybe sometimes about the author, and also sometimes about my reading, what I learned, what I enjoyed the most, what I discovered, and what I maybe struggled with. Today I want to talk about perspectives and how the perspective in The Invisible Man helped to immerse into the story. The book itself was first published in 1897. Prior to this, it was serialized in Pearson's Weekly, a British weekly periodical, very similar to the last book that I read on this channel, Treasure Island, by Robert Luis Stevenson, which was also first published chapter by chapter in the children's magazine Young Folks. But this is not the only similarity. Like Stevenson, Wells also wrote, at least according to John Andrew Sutherland, a British academic, newspaper columnist and author, boys' books for grown-ups. I absolutely loved this comparison because the novella felt like a wonderfully straightforward adventure story with a bit of mystery, with compelling, sometimes quirky and always entertaining side characters, and without any unnecessary, for the lack of a better word, embroidery. After The Time Machine and The Island of Dr. Moreau, in which Wells used a first-person narrator's perspective, The Invisible Man was written in third-person view, at least throughout most of the novella, except for the part in which Griffin, the Invisible Man, tells Kemp about his past. Sure, one could argue, of course, whether this is really a change of perspective because it's a monologue. Nevertheless, it's a different person telling their view, and therefore, well, a different perspective. And I always find these types of observations incredibly fascinating. Storytelling is an art form and also a craft, and the choice of narration perspective can make a big difference. While a third-person perspective can give the author quite a bit of freedom in some aspects, it also can make it more difficult to engage the readers on an emotional level. Changing the perspective, I think, was a great choice Wells made. The first-person view allows for the reader to dive into the story from a story character side. The narrator is a character in the story, and they are telling the story from their own perspective. In The Invisible Man, after the change happened, the narrator is also the main character of the story. Well, it's Griffin. And this automatically made the story much more an intimate and immediate experience for us. Of course, the first-person narrator can also be a character who's more on the side and more of an observer. In either case, the narrator is in some shape or form a part of the story. What's fascinating is that we, as the readers, know, and if just subconsciously know, that the story we read is not only limited by the narrator's perception, experiences, and knowledge, but also very much colored by their opinions and emotions. So while we accept the story and how it unfolds as one person's view, we do not necessarily accept everything as the whole objective truth and as facts, because we know that the view presented is subjective and limited. And this can be used to really great effect. In many cases, what we don't know and what is withheld from us can be more fascinating than what we plainly see or read about. There's always guessing and interpretation going on. It allows us to create our own image, our own story. And in stories or passages of stories written in a first-person perspective, we seemingly create the story of the person who is telling the story. Probably, and well, counterintuitively, even more so than when a story is told in a third-person view. Simply because a third-person perspective feels usually more neutral. And we tend, and also here, if just subconsciously, to accept things as facts when the narrator exists outside of the events of the story. There are slightly different variants of the third-person narrator, of course, ranging from the omniscient narrator who knows everything, right? Who can even look into the characters' minds, to the limited narrator who doesn't know about the feelings or motives of at least some of the characters, to the objective narrator who, well, simply reports. No matter which perspective the author used, it's always up to them which and how much information they give us, and when they give it to us, when they decide to withhold information, and which words they use. Revealing information at the right time and with the right words is, of course, one aspect that makes a writer great, and I think Wells was an extraordinary writer. He, bit by bit, revealed more of the Invisible Man's persona and his background, starting from him being a complete mystery, the person who is basically invisible when he arrives, cloaked and veiled, to the later revelation that he is literally invisible. In this part of the story, we as the readers are observers, which is reflected in the narration. We wonder what's going on. We follow along, maybe have a laugh at the quirky characters, and this slightly distant perspective allows us to laugh, because to laugh we always have to have a bit of distance to what's going on. And it also maintains a certain mystery. We want to know what's going on. And this keeps going on until the moment in the story when the Invisible Man meets his old friend Camp, and he starts to tell his story. And at this point, the story gets dark pretty quickly. The change in perspective here was, in my humble opinion, a stroke of genius. We learn about the Invisible Man's name, Griffin, about his experiments and his past. A lot of story parallels are revealed. Griffin is an albino, which is a wonderful detail and sort of parallel that plays on the whole invisibility subject. We learn that to finance his research and experiments, he stole money from his father, who then committed suicide. And this initial crime, well, is another parallel to the stealing of money when he was already invisible, to find a way to become visible again. We also learn what the sneezing is all about. To be fully invisible, he has to, of course, be naked. And since he was naked and the weather was cold, well, he caught a cold. Very, very simple. But making such a minor detail that the character was sneezing to an interesting and very important part of the story is also one of the great things that, in my opinion, makes Wells just an extraordinary writer. And in the end, the story perspective changed again to a third person's view with the raid of Camp's house and Camp's deception. And we end with a really quirky, darkly funny chapter in which it is revealed that Mr. Marvel, the tramp, used Griffin's stolen money to become a successful businessman and owner of an inn with the name The Invisible Man, and who tries to find out the secrets behind Griffin's invisibility by studying the seemingly lost manuscripts. And this is even sort of a cliffhanger in this beautifully crafted novella. Straightforward, yes, but thoroughly enjoyable, and with all the added bits and pieces of information that reveal what was going on or what's going on throughout the whole book. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed this book, and I hope you did as well. Let me know in the comments. One of Wells's inspirations for this novella was the poem The Perils of Invisibility by W.S. Gilbert. And finding that out was sort of a parallel for me, because I discovered William Schwenk Gilbert because of this YouTube project, right? This channel and the Sunday poem. I read some of Gilbert's poems already, and you can find the links to his poems in the description. The Perils of Invisibility is one of the Bab ballads by W.S. Gilbert, and I will end this video with a recital of this really funny poem, and I say bye-bye. Till next time. Maybe you'll join me on Sunday with the Sunday poem, next week with the start of a new book, or maybe you want to check out some of the readings that I already finished. You can find them all in playlists on this channel. See you. Here is The Perils of Invisibility by W.S. Gilbert. Old Peter led a wretched life. Old Peter had a furious wife. Old Peter, too, was truly stout. He measured several yards about. The little fairy Picklekin one summer afternoon looked in and said, "Old Peter, howdy-do? Can I do anything for you? I have 3 gifts. The first will give unbounded riches while you live. The second, health, where'er you be. The third, invisibility." "Oh, little fairy Picklekin," old Peter answered with a grin, "to hesitate would be absurd. Undoubtedly, I choose the third." "'Tis yours," the fairy said, "be quite invisible to mortal sight, whene'er you please. Remember me most kindly, pray, to Mrs. P." Old Mrs. Peter overheard wee Picklekin's concluding word, and, jealous of her girlhood's choice, said, "That was some young woman's voice." Old Peter let her scold and swear. Old Peter, bless him, didn't care. "My dear, your rage is wasted quite. Observe, I disappear from sight." A well-bred fairy, so I've heard, is always faithful to her word. Old Peter vanished like a shot. But then his suit of clothes did not. For when conferred the fairy's slim invisibility on him, she popped away on fairy wings without referring to his things. So there remained a coat of blue, a vest, and double eyeglass too, his tail, his shoes, his socks as well, his pair of... No, I must not tell. Old Mrs. Peter soon began to see the failure of his plan, and then resolved, I quote the bard, to hoist him with his own petard. Old Peter woke next day and dressed, put on his coat and shoes and vest, his shirt and stock, but could not find his only pair of... Never mind. Old Peter was a decent man, and though he twigged his lady's plan, yet, hearing her approaching, he resumed invisibility. "Dear Mrs. P., my only joy!" exclaimed the horrified old boy. "Now give them up, I beg of you. You know what I'm referring to." But no, The cross old lady swore she'd keep what I said before, to make him publicly absurd. And Mrs. Peter kept her word. The poor old fellow had no rest. His coat, his stock, his shoes, his vest were all that now met mortal eye. The rest, invisibility. Now, madam, give them up, I beg. I've bad rheumatics in my leg. Besides, until you do, it's plain I cannot come to sight again. For though some mirth that might afford to see my clothes without their lord, yet there would rise indignant oaths if he were seen without his clothes. But no, resolved to have her quiz, the lady held her own and his, and Peter left his humble cot to find a pair of you know what. But here's the worst of this affair. Whene'er he came across a pair already placed for him to don, he was too stout to get them on. So he resolved at once to train, and walked with all his main. For years he paced this mortal earth to bring himself to decent girth. At night, when all around is still, you'll find him pounding up a hill, and shrieking peasants whom he meets fall down in terror on the peats. Old Peter walks through wind and rain, resolved to train and train and train until he weighs 12 stone or so, and when he does, I'll let you know.